What's up guys, Jimmy here, and today I want to talk about the competitive environment of Street Fighter 6. There's been a lot of talk lately about how consoles, specifically the PlayStation 5, is not a great environment to play, well, these big premier events for the Capcom Pro Tour, and I want to share my thoughts on that. So let's start off with a series of salty tweets from Endingwalker, who's a very accomplished player at this point, and who's been pretty upset about his experience at Kings of the World because of the PlayStation 5 experience. And I'm just putting him out there as an example. There are a lot of other players who feel the same way, so let's take a look. So what did he have to say? So he starts off by saying that the PlayStation 5 is not a competitive console, it's inconsistent, laggy, the vast majority of pro players use PC to practice, flying 10 hours to go to a tournament and lose to the setup without learning is not okay. He continues by saying, if I fly to the UK from Japan and my whiff punishes don't work, I can't block or parry overheads or fireballs, I can't do my combos, my supers don't come out, or in general the stuff you practice, game plans, and ECT don't work. Then it just feels irrelevant. Please standardize PC. PlayStation 5 tournaments in a first to two format especially simply is not an accurate reflection of skill, even more so at high level for Street Fighter 6. The reason pros practice on PC is because it is much better and allows you to react to more things more consistently due to less lag. When I say inconsistent, I mean that from tournament to tournament, each PlayStation 5 is different. Hell, stream setups and pool setups are almost always different, either better or worse. Sometimes pool setups can be okay and others are bad. It's so stupid. As you can tell, Endingwalker is pretty upset about what had happened, and honestly, I agree with him in so many ways because there are so many things that you have to prepare for, there's so much work that has to be done, and it just doesn't feel rewarding when all of your hard work goes to waste because you practice something that is really difficult. And Endingwalker is a perfect example of a player that will actually go for something very difficult, something that requires really great reaction times. He's known for that. And if the setup does not actually allow him to play like that, his entire strategy is out of the window. So what did he prepare for so long? You know, it's not rewarding. Now, the sad part about this is the PlayStation 5, when it was launched, it was tested on input lag and other variables, and it turned out that it was actually a decent console. For the first time ever, actually, we've had a situation where input lag between PC and PlayStation was negligible, pretty much. It was a pretty good situation for console players because they weren't at a massive disadvantage for the first time. So I've been around for a very long time. I mean, I've started with Street Fighter 4 pretty much. I've played Street Fighter 2 as a kid as well, but competitively I really started with Street Fighter 4, and in that era things were very different. So I want to give you guys a quick reminder of what input lag used to be like back then. I remember having discussions back then in 2009 about Xbox being the best console ever for Street Fighter 4 back then. But what it was really like, I mean, if we talk about input lag, the Xbox 360 had around 5 frames of input lag for Street Fighter 4. And on PC, even back then, it was around 3 frames. So it was already a really, like, a noticeable difference between those two platforms. But back then, PC players, and I know that firsthand because PC players were laughed at because they were not the serious players. The competitive players were on Xbox. And I mean, nowadays, this seems kind of silly, but that's what it used to be like, at least in Germany. I'm not sure what the US was like or other regions, but PC players were basically the casual players. And even though we were playing on the platform with the lowest input lag, and when I went to my first tournament for Xbox 360, I couldn't do any combos because there was so much lag. I couldn't anti-air, I couldn't do anything because I was just not used to it. So yeah, back then Xbox was considered the right console and the good console. It had 5 frames of input lag, but not only that, it had consistent frame rate issues. I noticed like right away when I was playing on Xbox that every single time you did any ultra, like the game would stutter all of a sudden and would barely keep up with the FPS. And it was such a bad experience. I was like, wow, that's the tournament standard. Well, yeah, back then that was the tournament standard. The reason why the Xbox 360 was known as the good console back then was because in comparison to the PlayStation 3, it was pretty good. The PlayStation 3 had around 6 to 7 frames of input lag for Street Fighter 4, so it was a lot worse than the Xbox 360. And yeah, a quick reminder as well, even though in 2009, Evo for Street Fighter 4 was played on Xbox, it was actually changed like 1 year later to the PlayStation 3, and people were pretty upset about that because it meant a significantly worse experience for the players. But, and this is where we get into the juicy part about like how tournaments are organized. I mean, I'm not a tournament organizer myself, but I mean, it's pretty obvious that if you have somebody who's willing to handle a significant chunk of the financial investment for a tournament, which is like what platform to play on, then that's a significant reason to, well, go with that platform. And as far as I know, Sony was a sponsor for EVO 2010. At least partly it was. I'm not quite sure if they sponsored the entire thing, but they definitely gave the event the PlayStation 3, so it made sense to use them, even though the player experience was not optimal. Street Fighter 4 was eventually released to the PlayStation 4 with 8 frames of input lag, so it actually got even worse. So that was our great tournament standard back then, you know? With the patch, Capcom was able to significantly reduce the input lag though, so it was 4 to 5 frames if I remember correctly. So yeah, it was much better and much closer to Xbox, even better than Xbox when the game was finally patched, and then we had a somewhat acceptable state for the game. But you have to keep in mind, at that point, Street Fighter 4 was a really old game. Obviously, a newer console like the PlayStation 4 was gonna run better on the PlayStation 4 compared to old generations. So to recap the Street Fighter 4 era, we can say the input lag was wildly inconsistent, and even frame rate issues were normal back then and not really considered a problem. Maybe because the online experience with delayed-based netcode and offline play was already such a massive discrepancy. It was a different time, and people accepted the fact that the technology just wasn't quite there yet, and they had to try to make the best out of it. And that actually changed with the release of Street Fighter V. So there was a new technology on the horizon to make the offline and online experience come closer together, and that was rollback-based netcode. There was a lot of hope with Street Fighter V that we're finally getting a much better experience online, and maybe even more importantly so, not so much of a big discrepancy between offline and online, because every time you went to an offline event after playing online, you actually had to get used to the input lag. You had to get used to your combo routes and everything. It was a massive problem in Street Fighter 4, and we had really high hopes Street Fighter 5 would solve that. So did Street Fighter 5 deliver? Well, not so much. I think a lot of you guys will remember the 8 frames of input lag for the PlayStation 4 version, especially in comparison to the PC version, which was much better. It had around 3 to 4 frames of input lag, and it was just really bad. It was really bad input lag. I think frame rate was okay, but I mean, at this point, if you're used to even the Xbox 360 back then with the frame rate issues, okay, but you were much better off with the input lag of the Street Fighter 4 era. So this was not acceptable. A couple of years, I think it actually took a couple of years, and Capcom finally patched the input lag and brought it closer to what it used to be in Street Fighter 4 with 4 to 5 frames of input lag. But that was not really enough. I mean, this whole video here is about showcasing problems with the game, especially console versus PC, and how the tournaments might be affected. I can tell you, like, people had wild discussions back then, like back in the Street Fighter 5 era, about consistency when it comes to the frame rate, specifically on the PlayStation 4. There were discussions about whether the training stage would offer better input lag, and all of a sudden, not only did we have discussions about general frame rate and input lag, but we actually had a discussion about what stages to play on and what stages to avoid. And I remember this issue used to exist in Street Fighter 4 as well, but it was just never a determining factor for tournament players. I remember almost nobody would specifically go for just training stage for a tournament match. Sometimes it would happen, but most of the time people would just go random select. And in Street Fighter 5, this seemed to be the same case, but for some reason online people were a lot more sensitive due to your stage selection. So now we have this discussion, training mode or training stage, it was supposedly much better off and had way less frame rate issues. And I made a video about that as well. Like, this topic brought so much attention to everyone because at one point I refused to play on training stage because I just want to have something visually more interesting. And people would start to block me online for not picking training stage. I noticed that some players would actually refuse to play me as a result of that. And yeah, I made a video about that, and on my PlayStation 4, there were no frame rate issues. Like, at least for my testing, there was no difference between the stages, whether it was online or offline, whether it was training stage or supposedly some of the other stages that were so demanding, supposedly, that the PlayStation 4 couldn't handle them. I couldn't find any difference, and I know that a couple of others have also tried to show frame rate issues and they failed. In fact, training stage was actually not even doing so well on the PlayStation 4 for Street Fighter 5. Other stages, like stages that were supposedly more demanding, would do better. Not much better, but you know, like, it doesn't seem to matter what you're picking, but people have this in their mind that everything was wrong if you didn't play on training stage. I think ultimately it came down to people just being really upset with the online inconsistencies back in the Street Fighter 5 era. The online experience in Street Fighter 5 was just not very good, and people would just try to find some kind of pattern, whether it was the stage selection or whether it was something else. Like, people were desperate to get in control of their Street Fighter matches, and I think it really shows. People get really desperate when they're trying to put a lot of effort into something and the result is wildly inconsistent because of things that are outside of their own control. And I think this is what we're seeing with Street Fighter 6 as well, and with the tournament experiences, because now the situation is actually much better. But because of how much better it is, every single thing that is not perfect gets a lot more attention. So let's get back to the current generation. Street Fighter 6 was released last year on the PlayStation 5, Xbox Series S and X, and on PC, obviously. And what about input lag? Is it actually better now? Obviously it is. As I mentioned earlier, this is the first generation that doesn't see any major difference between console and PC. The PlayStation 5 version and the Xbox version have around 3 to 4 frames of input lag. They're like really close to PC, which is well around 3 frames of input lag. You can only get a little bit better than console if you go really high refresh rate. Like, I'm talking 240 hertz or higher. That's when you can push the input lag a little bit below what consoles can do. But that's a really high bar, you know? Like, we've never had a situation like that before where the consoles were not obviously much weaker. So yeah, now we have different problems with the consoles, and in my opinion, this is what I was trying to get at with this entire like discussion about the history of input lag and frame rate issues we used to have in Street Fighter 4 and 5. Like, we had different problems there. Now the online netcode is good. Now the input lag is good. There are no obvious frame rate issues. But if you go to a tournament, and well, that's where you're going to be noticing minor inconsistencies that are gonna, well, destroy your whole experience. Because now if you go to a tournament, all of a sudden you'll notice much more obviously that the monitor that you're playing on is not perfect. The console might be slightly overheating and causing inconsistencies with the frame rate. This might have been overlooked in previous generations of Street Fighter, but now it's much more obvious. And when I say like minor inconsistencies, like that's the wording that I used earlier, it's not supposed to mean that it's not a big deal. It is a big deal. It means exactly what Ending Walkers said. All of a sudden, the strategy that you practice doesn't work anymore. And so much work goes to waste, and there's $1 million on the line for the Capcom Pro Tour, and you've wasted so much energy into this, and that's frustrating, and rightfully so. So we definitely need to have a higher standard. I mean, at this point, we might as well take a look at the picture that was posted from the event as well. Shoutouts to Chris Masters for providing this picture of the Kings of the World tournament. Now, I'm not quite sure if this, what I'm watching right here, is actually a problem that they had to deal with, or if it was just a countermeasure just in case they're trying to make things better for the people, give them more confidence in the PlayStation 5. They had the covers removed, they had an additional fan. Not sure if the direction of the fan is correct. It's hard to see from this. I really hope they didn't try to direct the fan to the exhaust fan on the PlayStation 5, because the exhaust fan obviously is trying to, get heat out of the system. So if you're blowing air into the exhaust fan, that's not going to be very helpful. But in any case, you can see people are really, creative about how to keep the PlayStation 5 cool. So let's talk about the solution that is supposedly PC gaming. Just instead of having the PlayStation 5 that overheat, just put PCs there and you're good to go. Right? I mean, right now I'm recording off my PC that I built myself. I buy the components, I put them together. There are not going to be any thermal issues if I buy the right components. No problem, right? But that's not, unfortunately, that's not how tournaments work. You need hundreds of systems. You need to get them cheaply somehow. TOs are not, at least I don't think TOs are making a ton of money from this. They have to make sure that they get components as cheaply as possible, and usually that means you're going to be involving a sponsor. So if Sony is sponsoring an event, there you go, you solve the major issue for your tournament, you get the PlayStation 5s from Sony, and you're good to go. No headaches, nothing. Now you get the PCs, it's going to be a lot more expensive. You need more room potentially, and by the way, if you're not going to get more room, if you're like, no, they're all-in-one PCs, they are really slim, the form factor is really slim, and it's all good, Well, if you're gonna go that route, aren't you introducing the same problem that the PlayStation already has? The whole reason the PlayStation doesn't work so well as a tournament is because the console itself was not designed for this purpose. The console was designed for an average gamer, and an average gamer uses the console how many hours a day? I don't even know, but surely not 24/7, right? And at an event, you need to have these consoles running for long periods of time. On top of that, you're moving them around. Potentially, some of them are damaged just from the trip to the event. All of this stuff can happen, and this is not really what these consoles were made for. And as I said, if you go with PC gaming, you're gonna have to go with something a little bit bigger, because otherwise you're gonna run into the same thermal issues. So yeah, I think you get my point. My point is, the problem isn't as easy to solve as it seems on surface level. People are like, just do PC gaming, all good, No, it's not that easy to do, and even if you can pull it off, you might still have issues because the monitors, by the way, are mostly, from my experience at tournaments, and I've been to a lot of tournaments, the discussion is usually not about the consoles. It is about the display. The displays at an event can be wildly inconsistent. And yeah, you gotta solve that problem as well. Now, all of a sudden, you have so many different problems that you need to take care of as a tournament organizer. Eddie Walker rightfully mentioned that the stream setup is usually different from the setups that you see outside the stream. So you can't even get used to a single setup and be like, I'm going to be playing on this, I'm going to be practicing on this setup at a tournament, and then I'm good to go. It doesn't work like that. If you're a high-profile player, you're going to have to play on the stream setup, and that is usually different from the setup that you potentially practice on for your pool play. Good luck with that. So yeah, before I conclude this, I just want to mention that, as you can see, we've come a long way from what it used to be like to be a Street Fighter player 15 years ago, with inconsistent frame rate on consoles, horrible input lag on consoles. Nowadays, it's a lot smoother, but the tournament experience is still a problem. And it's a problem for the same reasons as it used to be. But the expectations of players are obviously higher, and rightfully so. There's a lot of money on the line, and I think everybody is wishing for improvements in that regard. You just want to, as a viewer, you want to go there, you want to view a tournament and you want to see Ending Walker perform at his absolute peak. doing ridiculous stuff with this low input lag that we have, no frame rate issues and everything. That's what everybody wants, right? We all benefit from that. I have my doubts on whether this is going to be improving over time. I just think that tournaments are really difficult to do, and there's probably a reason why we finally, well, had some big issues solved, like TVs, for example. I can play on my PlayStation 5 in my living room on a big TV with low input lag. That was unthinkable 15 years ago. But priorities changed because, well, the gamers are older now, and so the manufacturers of these devices, they have noticed that, oh wow, we gotta do better than that. I mean, 20 years ago, if you played on a plasma TV, it was absolutely insane input lag. You couldn't play on this thing. Things have improved a lot in that regard, but I just think there are other things, like the tournament experience, are a lot harder to do consistently. So yeah, guys, that's gonna be it from me. Definitely let me know in the comments below, what do you think on this topic? Any and all thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, take care, and I'll see you guys soon.